Hello everybody, my name's Zahir and I want to welcome you all to my channel Plants and Paints, where today we're going to be talking about these two beautiful plants here, which are caladiums. Obviously we're going to talk about caladiums in general, but these are my two examples of caladiums here for you. Now a few of you are probably thinking straight off the bat that, oh my god, did I miss the vote or anything like that? Because generally what I do on a weekly basis is I put up a vote for which video people want me to make for care and maintenance of a particular plant. And this week what I actually decided to do was to pick the plant myself. The reason being is because it's getting towards the end of the growing season for the caladiums and pretty soon they're going to go dormant. I've put them up in my votes in the past and they've got quite high vote counts, but they've not actually won the votes. And because I know there are going to be people who are waiting for the opportunity to see this video, I thought, you know, obviously because the time where they go dormant is so close, that I would actually make this video this week. So sorry for those people who are waiting for my vote, and I hope you don't mind me making this video for those people who have been waiting for the caladium care and maintenance video. So as I mentioned, today we're going to be talking about the caladium. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start with a general introduction and a little bit of information about my personal experience with the caladiums, and then we're going to move on to the care and maintenance of the plant. So the caladium is a genus of flowering plants in the family of Araceae. Now the plants natively can be found growing in South America. This plant is such a popular plant within the plant hobby, and with over 1,000 named cultivars available, there's definitely going to be something out there for you, something that you're going to enjoy having in your collection. Now basically the way it started for me was that I saw a post up on someone's Instagram and it was of a caladium, and you know, I was blown away by it. I thought, you know, I definitely need to have a look, see if I can find some of these myself. So I started looking into it, and the first ones that I came across that I thought would be perfect for where I actually want to end up keeping the caladiums was the White Christmas one, which is this one here. So I started looking around. I found a seller who was due in a stock of caladiums, so I kept checking on their website every day, and eventually they got them in stock. And luckily enough for me, the White Christmas was one of them, so I put in an order straight away. And lucky for me that I actually did that, because the next day when I went back, because she had quite a few to choose from, I was contemplating buying, you know, a few different ones, but I wasn't sure which ones I wanted. So I was doing a bit of research that evening, and then the next day when I went back, they were actually all gone. So I'm very lucky that I actually put my order in when I did to actually get this plant. Now, I actually only bought the White Christmas caladium, and I got a free gift with this plant, which was a bulb for the red flash. So when I got this plant, it was, you know, semi-adult at the time. It had a few leaves on it, maybe 4 or 5 leaves. And throughout the growing period, it ended up with maybe 15 leaves on it. And I must have planted the red flash about a month after I got this. So this at the moment has actually stopped producing new leaves now, and it's getting to the point where it's actually going to go dormant quite soon. So these are the last 3 leaves that I'm sure that I'm going to see with this particular plant. But because I planted the red flash quite a bit later on, after this one's growth had actually started, my red flash is still producing new growth, which you can see here. I've got 3 new leaves that are getting ready to unfurl. I've got some new growth still growing out from the soil. So I'm imagining I'm probably going to have this for a further 2 months at least, I'm hoping. So it's such a popular plant within the plant keeping hobby, and with over 1,000 named cultivars available, as I mentioned, there's definitely going to be something out there for you. And they come in such a wide range and variety of colors that is staggering the amount of choice that is available for the individual to choose from. So they come in colours ranging from green, red, white, pink. I've even seen them in purple. I've seen them in blue, so like royal blue. I've seen them in a sky blue colour. And those colours all mixed together, they come in as many combinations as you can imagine. I've seen literally hundreds of different colour combinations. So all you would have to do is go onto the internet, type in Caladium, click the images section, and just scroll through, and you will see so many different color varieties that, as I mentioned, there's definitely going to be something that you're going to like. And because it's such a beautiful plant, I can't imagine that there are many people out there who wouldn't like to have one of these in their collection. So the plant itself goes by several different names. When I was researching the names of the plant on the internet, I actually came across about 15 different names. So I'm not going to list all of the names. I'm going to list the ones that I have found to be the more generic ones. So number one, in its native place of origin, it seems to be called the elephant ear, so the Caladium elephant ear. I can imagine for obvious reasons it's called that, although, you know, not to be confused with other plants that seem to go by the same name as well, because I've come across so many plants that they're saying seem to call the elephant ear, like the Amazonicas, and you know, the I could probably imagine about 20 different plants that go by that name, but you've got the Caladium elephant ear as well. It's called that in its native environment. And also you've got the Heart of Jesus, which seems to be a name that is commonly called in America. And you've got angel wings. Now angel wings seems to be something that is more commonly called in England, Great Britain. So the first time I actually came across that name, I'd found the plant online. I decided, because generally it's something that people grow outdoors, I thought I'll just go and give it a try at my local garden centre, see if I can find one there. And what actually happened was, by the time I got to the garden centre, because I found it one day, the very next day I was down at the garden centre, and by the time I got there I'd actually forgotten what the name of the plant was. So I'm standing trying to explain to this lady in the garden centre for a good 20 minutes that, oh, you know, there's a plant, it's got big leaves, they're shaped like arrows, or, you know, they come in a few different variety of shape forms, so spades, arrows, and so on and so forth. And they come in a whole different array of colours, the leaves can get quite big, and so on and so forth. And the woman, she was looking at me with this puzzled look, as if like to say, what is this guy going on about? You know, I felt like a bit of a donut, to put it in as plain a terms as possible. But eventually, after my descriptions, she managed to figure out what I was talking about, and she actually mentioned it as angel wings. And then I got confused, and I was like, are we talking about the same plant? So she basically said, okay, we don't sell them here, I'm sorry, and you're going to have to look elsewhere. And that she didn't know any other garden centre that actually sold them either. So I went away thinking that, you know, maybe we were on a different page and we weren't talking about the same plant. So I came home, I typed angel wings plant into my phone, and there it was the Caladium. So she was absolutely right. And, you know, good on her for the effort of trying to understand me explaining to her what particular plant that was, because as you can imagine, trying to explain to her, no, you've got a plant, it's got a big colourful leaf, and, you know, it produces lots of leaves, and so on and so forth, that pretty much covers so much. And the fact that she actually managed to find out what plant I was talking about, now I think about it, is, you know, she's very good at her job, so well done to her. I think I've ranted on a bit sorry, about my particular experience with caladiums, and I've given you a general introduction as to where they're from and some of their more commonly known names, and the fact that you can get, you know, well over 1,000 named cultivars. That doesn't include the ones that haven't even been named yet. So, you know, there's a staggering amount of choice and variety for you out there. So what we're going to actually do now is we're going to move on to the care and maintenance of the plant. So what we're going to do, we're going to start with the lighting conditions required for the Caladium. So the Caladium actually requires medium lighting conditions and will thrive in filtered and shaded locations. So this plant won't tolerate bright light at all. I mean, I don't know if you can tell from the video, but if I put my hand behind the plant, you can actually see my hand through the plant. So the leaves are like wafer thin. They're like paper, you know, they're so delicate and they're so thin that any type of sun rays that are hitting them directly are going to end up burning the leaves. So they're not going to tolerate direct sun for any sustained period of time. It will damage the plant very quickly. So you actually want to make sure that you're keeping it in a filtered or shaded location to make sure that you're getting optimum health out of the plant, and that you're not burning it and causing it distress and actually ending up destroying the plant. So ideally what you want is an east or a north facing window. Now, perfect for me, I have a north facing window in my living room, and also it goes with the requirements of most of the plants I keep. I'm sort of pushing over towards aeroids now, although I do keep other plants as well, such as calatheas. I keep different types of pothos, and you know, so on and so forth. If you want to see more of my collection and know what kind of things I keep, then you're welcome to pop over to my Instagram channel. I will leave a link in the description. But yeah, you want to keep this in a shaded location just to make sure that you're actually giving the plant the correct lighting conditions. So if, for instance, you don't have a north or an east facing window, it doesn't mean that you can't keep the plant. It just means that you have to filter the light that it's receiving. So let's just say, for instance, you've got the most exposed kind of window, which would be a south facing window, and you like to keep your plants in the room where that south facing window is. So you can take them off to the side of that room where the room happens to fall into the shade, which would result in it being filtered light. Or if you want to keep them quite close to the window, providing you've got net curtains in your window, I would advise you keep your net curtains drawn so that the light passes through there, that actually becomes filtered, and that will be sufficient to not burn the leaves. So they will still get light, but it will be filtered, and they should stay quite happy with that. Now, providing the right lighting condition will ensure that the plant produces the right amount of growth for you. So, you know, the growing season for this plant generally is probably about 5 months, 4 to 5 months, 5 months even, I would suggest. So in that growing season, you can probably end up with quite a substantial plant, providing it's in the right lighting condition. So do try and stick to that where possible, okay? What I'm going to do now, I've spoken about lighting quite enough there. I think I've covered it in enough detail. What we're going to do is we're going to move on to potting mix. Now I'm going to mention 2 different ways for you to tackle the potting mix for this plant, because if you want to keep it in the optimum conditions and you want to get the absolute best growth out of this plant, and you want a very full and very bushy looking Caladium, then there is a particular type of potting mix that it actually really seems to thrive in. So what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to add the following components to your potting mix, which will be peat moss, compost, a fine bark mix, and some decomposed manure. Now, I understand that that isn't something that generally every houseplant keeper is going to have available to them. They're quite, you know, distinctive things to be requesting for you to put in your potting mix. But if you don't have them, don't despair, because you can still grow caladiums and they will still grow really, really well. I mean, this one here has the mentioned potting mix in it, and this one here has my other potting mix. And as you can see, you know, my plant is happy, it's very healthy, although this one during its growing period was a lot fuller than what this one was. Even though this one is still producing new growth, it has slowed down. It was never quite as full looking as the White Christmas was. I mean, my White Christmas had at one stage about 15 leaves, and they're all pretty, you know, I had leaves that were probably about this big, which is, you know, a very substantial size. And this is the largest leaf that I actually got on this one in the potting mix that I'm going to mention next. So if you can't provide the initial potting mix which I mentioned, which was peat moss, compost, fine bark mix and decomposed manure, then you can go with the other potting mix, but just expect that, you know, you're not going to get every leaf to be a gargantuan sized leaf in comparison to what we sort of have in here, because I've got a mixture of sizes. Like I mentioned, this was the biggest leaf that I managed to get. So what you can do is you can actually replicate that potting mix by just using a good quality, well draining potting soil with some orchid bark mix in there. And what you want to do with your orchid bark mix is you want to get the orchid bark, and it's quite soft, so you can break that orchid bark down into little pieces. Break that down into little pieces, mix it with your well draining potting soil, add a couple of handfuls of perlite just to make sure that you've got a lot of oxygenation in there. And with this you can still achieve really good results for your plant. So don't despair, like I mentioned, if you don't have the potting mix that I mentioned earlier, which is the peat, moss and fine bark, you can get away with using the potting mix that I've suggested as well. So I think I've talked enough about potting mix there. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move on to the watering of the plant. So the Caladium likes a moist but soggy environment, so try to keep the potting mix evenly moist throughout and only water when you notice that the top inch of the soil starts to get dry. Now, to keep it evenly moist, you don't want to, you want to water little and often. You don't want to let it dry out significantly and then start adding water to it. You need to keep this evenly moist, which just means like keeping it damp. So once you notice the top inch of soil starts to dry and it starts to feel dry to the touch towards the top inch down into the soil, it'll be time to water, but just water it a very little bit so that you're just getting that top inch wet again. Now, if you start noticing any runoff water, make sure that you're getting rid of that, because the last thing you want to do is have that runoff water soak back up into the soil, because it will create a very boggy and very soggy environment, and the plants, they don't actually like that. So to prevent things like root rot and, you know, the bulb itself starting to decay, and, you know, you're not being able to take it on from one year to the next, you just need to make sure that you're keeping it moist and not soaked. So if you are watering the plant, it might take you a little bit of time to get used to just adding that little bit of water at the right amount, and you may still be getting a little bit of runoff. Just make sure that you're getting rid of that excess water. Don't leave it sitting in the drip tray under the plant. So as far as watering the plants go, I use filtered water. So I use filtered water for all of my plants, but I wouldn't suggest that's a bad thing. I would never suggest to anyone to take your water from your tap for your indoor plants which are located in pots and start adding tap water into that plant, because the chlorine buildup that is eventually going to happen within that soil, because it can't get rid of it, is going to be quite substantial and quite a lot, and it's going to end up damaging the rooting system. It's going to end up burning the leaves, and this kind of damage is irreparable. So, you know, you can flush the soil out to get rid of what you can, but once the plant started taking it up, the damage that it's going to cause, you can't reverse that damage. So I would suggest never really use tap water for your plants. So as I was mentioning, I use filtered water when I water all of my plants. So generally what I'll do, I'll filter my water, I will leave it out for 24 hours. The reason I do that is, number one, to make sure it's at room temperature, and number two, just to make sure that if your filter hasn't managed to remove all of the contaminants that are in the water that it should be able to move through filtration, that you're giving the water enough time for that to evaporate out of that water by a natural process. And I think 24 hours is enough to allow that process to happen. Also, obviously, speaking about getting your water to room temperature, putting cold water after filtering it straight from filtering into the plant pot can cause shock to the plant, and if you're in the growing season, that isn't going to benefit you at all, because it will stunt the growth of the plant. So it will make it become like it's becoming dormant, although it's not. It will just stop the growth, so the plant will go into shock. The roots won't react very nicely to being doused with cold water, and it will just slow your whole growth process down. So just to make sure that you're producing that nice lush new growth on a regular basis, you know, the water that you're watering your plants with, make sure that you're keeping it at the same temperature that the room is. Hence, leaving it out for up to 24 hours ensures that that is the case. I mean, you could leave it for 4 or 5 up to 6 hours, and it will get to room temperature. But I will leave it for 24 hours, as I mentioned before, just to make sure it leaches out any bonded contaminants that it's able to do through evaporation also. So other things you can use mineral water, so bottled mineral water. That's very good for your plants, contains a lot of the natural elements that they need. And you can also use demineralized or deionized water, whichever way around you want to call it. And if you're using demineralized water, I would suggest for you to use fertilizer periodically in that water, because it's been stripped of all its nutrients. But we will talk about fertilization a little bit further into the video. So I think I've talked about watering enough there. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move on to humidity. Now, the caladiums need a high level of humidity to keep the foliage looking happy and healthy. To raise the humidity for your caladiums, there are several things you can do. So I don't know where this cough has come from today, but as I'm sure you can see in the background here, I've got mist coming over my plants. Basically over in the corner there, I've got a humidifier running, and my caladiums live right here. So I keep my caladiums, especially now they're coming towards the end of the growing season, because I want to prolong their growth as much as possible. I keep them in very, very close proximity to my humidifier. Now, not everybody is going to have a humidifier, I do understand that. So there are other ways that you can raise the humidity around your plant. So the first thing that you can do is you can get yourself a little misting bottle, so a little squirty bottle. You can fill that up with your filtered water, and you can mist your plants 2 to 3 times a day. I actually mist my plants every day. You know, even though they've got the humidifier, they also get a daily misting as well. It keeps them very happy. They love a very high humidity, so that just helps replicate that for them as much as possible. So I will mist them early in the morning, and then when I return from work in the late afternoon towards early evening, I will give them a misting again, and that generally just goes for most of my plants. I'll pretty much mist everything, and that will help to keep them happy. So other things you can do as well is you can get yourself a plant tray, and you can fill that plant tray with pebbles. So cover the plant tray with pebbles, and then half fill that plant tray with water. So fill the water halfway up the level of the pebbles, and then sit your plant pots on top of those pebbles, just making sure that the pot itself is not sitting in the water. So make sure that that water level is below the pots, and what that will do, that will naturally evaporate around the plants, raising the humidity, creating a naturally humid environment for them. Another thing you can do is you can get yourself little water vessels, so little bottles or ramekins, or you know, anything that you can imagine that you can put a little container of water and just place a few around your plant pots, and that will also evaporate around the plants and help to raise the humidity around them. Another thing you can do is, if you've got quite a lot of plants, humidity loving plants for instance, let's say you've got 10 or 15 plants and they just happen to be ones that enjoy a high humid environment, what you can actually do is you can group all those plants together, and that on its own will raise the humidity around the plants and create a more natural humid environment for them. So these are all ways that you can raise your humidity. And as I mentioned, the caladium actually needs a high level of humidity to keep the foliage looking happy and healthy, and to prolong the growth cycle of the plant. Because growing indoors, you're avoiding the cold and the things that will naturally set the plant into dormancy. So you can actually stretch an extra month, maybe even 2 months growing time out of these plants when keeping them indoors, and humidity is a big part of that. As I mentioned, although I planted this a month after I got this, and this must have started growing a month before I received it, this looks like it's going to give me another 2 months growth yet. And if these were living outdoors, they will be going dormant right now, because we're getting cold evenings. The leaves don't take very kindly to low temperatures, which we're going to talk a little bit about soon. And they actually would have gone into dormancy, or be well on their way into dormancy by now. So I've spoken enough there about humidity. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to move on to fertilizing your plants. Now, I'm only going to talk very briefly about the fertilizer, because there's generally not much to it. I mean, you're going to go to a garden center or a plant shop, or you're going to order your fertilizer online, and it's going to have your directions on the back. Just as an example, it might say to you, for every 1 liter of water, you need to put 10 ml of this solution into the water. I would recommend that you cut that back by 50%. So you want to add it at 50% dilution rate as to what is recommended. The reason that I am saying this is because if you're fertilizing a plant and it's outdoors, the space that fertilizer has got to disperse itself is vast. And when you're dealing with pots, it's very localized, so there's nowhere for it to go. And the last thing you want to do is get a build-up of nutrients or build-up of salts in the soil, because eventually it's going to bond itself to the rooting system. The root's going to keep trying taking it up when it can't physically take anymore. It's going to cause clogging of the roots. It's going to end up burning the leaves because there's too much nutrient in the plant. And it can cause so many adverse effects to your plant. So just make sure that whatever's written on there, make sure that you put in half. Now, the reason I say half is because this plant generally has got quite a big growth pattern, so it will need a significant amount of nutrient to maintain its healthy growth pattern. So generally, with most of my other plants, I will do it at about 25% dilution rate in comparison to what the manufacturer recommends. And as you can see, my plants generally are happy, but with this one, I'll do it at 50% because it's got such a quick growth rate. It's got a very slow lifespan throughout the year. It's got a short growing season, and it produces a lot within that growing season. So you got to make sure that it's well fed, okay? Okay, so I've talked enough about fertilizer there. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk a little bit about temperature. Now, the Caladium itself thrives in temperatures, let's say between 25 and 32 degrees Celsius. So I think in Fahrenheit that works out to about 70 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Forgive me if I'm wrong. I'm not used to using Fahrenheit. Celsius is my way of reading temperature. But with that 25 to 32 degrees Celsius, you want to make sure that there is as little fluctuation as possible. They don't like huge changes in temperature, even if you're within the parameters that they like to grow in. So you don't want evening temperature to be 25 and then day to go up to 32. You want to keep that fluctuation within about 2 to 3 degrees on average. If you can manage to do that, then that would be ideal, and all it means is that your plant will produce the biggest possible leaves it's going to produce. It will produce the most growth that it's going to be able to produce, and it will live for as long as it's possibly able to live before it goes into dormancy. And not sticking within those just means that you're going to get leaves that are not as big as they could possibly be. You're not going to get as full a plant as you possibly can have, and it might live a little less than what you intend it to live. It doesn't mean that you're going to end up killing the plant. It's just some parameters to keep it within just to make sure that it's a very happy plant. The growing season for this generally tends to be anywhere from 5 to 6 months, maybe 4 to 5 months. And obviously in that period of time the temperature naturally is going to change on its own anyway, but the plant will adapt to that. It's the fluctuation from day to night that you need to keep an eye on. So if it's 31 degrees one day and it's 33 degrees the next day, or it's 25 degrees one day and it's 27 degrees the next day, you're still working within that perimeter that you've been working in. You know, you're not going drastically outside of that, and anything above or below that is going to be something that naturally is occurring outside. So any adverse effects you're going to notice to your plants inside due to it, you would have noticed that outside anyway. So I think I've mentioned enough about temperature there. So finally, we're going to talk about toxicity. Now, before I move on to toxicity, I just want to give a quick mention that generally the information I've given you is for indoor plant care. Now, that doesn't mean that a lot of the information that I've actually put in the video doesn't suit outdoor plant care, because absolutely it does. It just means that there's a few things that you're not going to be able to do, like you're not going to be able to draw your curtains, for instance, to give it filtered light. So make sure if you're doing it outdoors, you're putting it in a shaded location. And also fertilizer, if you're fertilizing outdoors and you have the need to add fertilizer to your soil outside, then you know you might be able to stick to the manufacturer's specifications for that, because it's got a big area to disperse. It's not going to stay clogged up around the roots and in a small area where the plant is actually growing. It will move around in the soil and fertilize that soil for you. So bar a couple of things, you're absolutely fine to follow these rules as well. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about toxicity. Now, the reason I choose to mention in my videos when I know that a plant is toxic is because a lot of people, they'll go into a store or they'll buy something online and it won't come with adequate information about the level of toxicity. It will just say toxic to people, cats and dogs, and that generally will cover its description. So it doesn't give you the warning signs. It doesn't tell you what to look out for and how to know if this is a cause of something going wrong within your home. So what we're going to do, we're going to talk about the toxicity level in this plant. And this week in this particular plant, I do want to stress quite a lot about the level of toxicity of this plant. Now, people may have pets at home, so cats, dogs, birds, and so on and so forth, and also young children. Now, you know, your animals, they might like to have a little nibble on plants, and you definitely want to keep them away from this. You want to keep these out of reach of your cats, dogs, and birds, and things like that. You don't want them nibbling on these leaves. They can be quite toxic to them. But I'm going to focus primarily on people. The reason being, I frequently see, for instance, on Instagram, people have got their kids involved in their plant hobbies. Now, it's such a brilliant thing to do. I'm totally for that. My kids get involved with me with my plants as well, and you know, we have some great experiences going through this hobby together as a family. But it's good to know what you're getting yourself into, because the last thing you want is to make your own children sick or make yourself sick due to not having the correct information concerning a particular plant. Now, this plant here, if you're handling it and there's a chance that, you know, you might end up breaking something accidentally, it's worth putting a pair of gloves on. I'll go over the reasons for that a bit later. But if you've got children working with you and they're helping you deal with this particular plant, make them wear gloves. Be very aware, be conscious around them. Make sure that they're not putting their hands in their mouths after dealing with this plant, because it has very high levels of irritant in it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to point out to you what the signs are for ingestion of this plant and how it's going to affect a person or an animal. So it will start with burning and swelling of the mouth and lips, along with irritation, and also the esophagus. After that, it will start causing excessive salivation. So I'm describing it to you in the order that the symptoms actually start occurring. So as I mentioned, you're first going to get burning of the lips and swelling. Then you're going to get irritation to the mouth and the esophagus. And then you're going to get heavy salivation. So they might start uncontrollably, or you may start, or your pets may start uncontrollably dribbling, or, you know, salivating quite heavily. And then from there it will start causing quite serious gastric pains. So, you know, if you notice any of this, I would suggest check your plant straight away. Make sure that there's no damaged part of the plant. Make sure that you can take this out of the equation if you know that this may be part of that equation. So try and eliminate this as your first option, because if your kid's got a stomach ache, you're going to be able to treat that. But don't just assume that it's a stomach ache if you've got things like this around. Always be cautious and make sure that this is not the reason for that, because after the severe gastric pain comes breathing difficulties. Now, as you can imagine, anything to do with breathing difficulties is very serious. So when you notice that there's problems with the mouth, swelling of the lips and irritation, tongue, then they start getting problems with their throat, I'd be on the phone at that stage, maybe contacting an emergency service, explain to them that there's a possibility that this might be the reason. They may be able to give you some information over the phone as to what to do, or they may just say to you, right, we need you to get yourself straight down to the A&E. Now, as I mentioned, because of the progression of how serious it can get, and it can actually lead to breathing difficulties, and unfortunately that sometimes can involve young children, they wouldn't know how to cope with that situation. So please, you know, do take heed and do actually phone for medical advice in that sort of situation. Don't try and take this on yourself. You know, it is something that you will need advice for. Other things to watch out for, as I mentioned earlier, if you're having your children around the plant and they're repotting the plant and they break a stem and you haven't noticed because there's such amount of lush growth going on within the plant that it's time to repot it, and they've broken a stem and it's not been realized, but there's sap leaking out. If that sap gets on your skin from this particular plant, it can cause dermatitis and an intense itching and burning on your skin. So, you know, if anything like that happens, just go and start rinsing it off. And, you know, if you can't get rid of it, maybe make an appointment with your doctor. That's not something to be overly stressed about. But again, that is another level of toxicity that this plant has, which is why I'm suggesting that if you're handling the plant yourself and you think there's a chance that you may break something on the plant where it's going to end up with sap from the plant coming out and you might not notice it, it's always worth just putting a pair of latex gloves on, just to make sure that if that happens, you're not getting those irritants. Okay, so I think I've pretty much covered everything as far as the toxicity is concerned. I'm sorry I rambled on a little bit there, but I think it's quite important to cover that within the care and maintenance guide for this particular plant. And, you know, I hope it hasn't taken up too much time in the video, but I'm pretty much going to end the video here. I hope you've enjoyed my video today. My name's Zahir, this is Plants and Paints. If you're new to my channel, please don't forget to subscribe. If you enjoyed my video, give it a thumbs up. If you're new to subscribing to my channel, don't forget to hit the bell icon so that you can get notifications of future content coming out. My next week's video is actually going to be something very, very special. Unfortunately, guys, I'm not going to put up a vote again for next week. The reason being, I'm actually due to get a delivery of plants on Monday. They were supposed to have turned up by Friday, but they got delayed in customs for an extra day. They've been cleared from customs. I've got about 50 plants coming and they're all really really spectacular stuff. So I thought I would do a little update houseplant tour at that stage once I've got them all potted up and ready to actually start selling. So before I sell any of them, I'm just going to make a quick little update video to show you some of the things I'm actually going to have in my home and things that I'm going to